Okay, I think this works.
Yep.
So hopefully you can see the slides now. Can you see me
Yep.
as well?
Yes, I can see you. Yeah,
Okay.
all good.
All right, good to know. Okay.
All
So,
good.
great. Okay.
Well, wait. I should introduce you.
You do your bit.
I'll do my bit. Okay. Hi everybody. This is to welcome Anna Bloxam. Anna, like me, is a product of UCL and has also left for new pastures. Background is in osteoarchaeology and funerary archaeology. She did her PhD in burial practices and culture change, which is a very UCL type subject. Lectured prehistory at Canterbury Christ Church University, and is now an assistant professor in archaeology at Nottingham. She's a prehistorian, but this talk is mostly about early medieval culture change and interpretation of chronological data. So with that said, I will now hand over to Anna and we'll learn all about it.
Thank you. So thanks for having me today. Today I'm going to be talking mostly about early medieval social change and some of the work I've been doing with chronological modelling for it. But at the end, I'll come back to what it's been making me think about prehistory, because I am usually a prehistorian, so this is a foray into a different world for a bit. And it's got me thinking about what I would normally do and what I'm doing with other projects as well. So this is, let me, presentation. There we go. So this is a collaborative project. So we're wrapped up with it now, and it's there's a paper forthcoming from it. So it's collaborative between me looking at the dating evidence and Dr. Rhiannon Comio, who has several ongoing projects looking at corn drying kilns, and I'll explain what these are in a minute, and Dr. Andy Seaman, who is looking at hill forts in their various guises, but is mostly interested in post-Roman hill forts. So both Rhiannon and Andy have been working on their own data sets, their own projects for a long time, looking at these two separate categories or classes of site. And they had independently noticed that there were fluctuations in the evidence, with both of them spotting a change in the decline, a decline in use or a change in use in the early medieval period. So I was brought on board to this project to help them pull together the evidence from their two very different projects and try and work out, is there any chronological approach we can use to combine or compare the evidence from these data sets, work out if the change that they were each seeing happened at the same time or shows the same processes, and then finally, can analysis of chronology help identify potential causes for the changes that they were spotting. So I'll briefly go over what the evidence is that we were looking at. So with Andy's hill forts, he's collected quite a lot of evidence for post-Roman hill fort usage. So hill forts are usually thought of as Iron Age or prehistoric sites in Britain, but there's quite a lot of activity and evidence in the post-Roman period, particularly in Western Britain and Wales. So he's been doing a lot of work with data collection, but also new excavation of these sites, establishing the post-Roman chronology for a really wide variety of sites, which can collectively be called hill forts. They have evidence for feasting, drinking, evidence for imports, that's across Britain and wider across Europe, evidence for metal working, and then the distribution of metal objects out into the wider landscape. There's evidence for hunting and warfare. In some of the sites, there's evidence for record keeping. And collectively, this could be termed elite activity in this period. There's also some evidence for burial, that's both inhumation and cremation, and potentially some evidence for animal sacrifice. So there are lots of sites spread all across Western Britain, which is where we're focusing on for this study. And broadly speaking, it's a category of sites which has elite activity, but that activity is really closely tied into the wider landscape. So it's all stuff to do with the import and then redistribution of objects and people and social practices more widely. In the post-Roman period, there's evidence for reuse of older prehistoric sites, but also new construction of this type of location. They're often visually impressive. They are not all occupied, but they often have evidence for kind of short-term or intermittent activity, particularly assembly or gatherings. And the kind of interpretations of these sites is what they're used for is usually something to do with lordly or kingly residences, ceremonial centres, places of assembly, where all of this kind of high status activity is going on. So Andy has been looking at these in the post-Roman world and spotted that in around about the 6th or maybe the 7th century, there's a massive drop-off in the evidence that he's looking at. So he was interested, firstly, to ask me to have a look at some of the radiocarbon dates, which he's gathered from all the different sites, and try and work out if I could spot a pattern in what was going on and whether sites were declining or changing in use at the same time as each other. Rhiannon's set of sites are very different. They are these corn drying kilns. So corn in this sense is just any kind of grain, any cereal grain. And these are basically ovens used for drying out grain. So they're often found on their own. Some of them are in clusters of 2 or 3, but they're much smaller as sites than the hill forts. They are located in all sorts of different places, and she's focusing on Wales, but they are chronologically very broadly used. So they're prehistoric all the way up to medieval. And they are located at the same sites as the hill forts, so these kind of early medieval estate centres and hill forts, but also in other locations in the landscape too, like crossroads, fording places, and other types of assembly sites. They are used for drying out or malting grains, and according to Rhiannon, there's been a long misconception in the literature that they were associated with drying out grains after harvests, but the evidence found in them suggests that actually they were used for processing cleaned and dried grains. They weren't for drying out wet weather harvests or anything like that. So the aim is effectively to reduce moisture either before storage or to prepare the grains for milling and malting for ale making. So these are very different types of sites, but the scale of activity that they represent is beyond the needs of an individual household or small-scale farmstead or settlement. They are for producing and preparing huge amounts of grain, which is kind of more associated with, I guess, pulling together resources from across a wider landscape and some kind of centralized redistribution of the products of that. So even though it's a very different type of site, in some ways, they reflect the same kinds of activity in this post-Roman period, where they seem to reflect something to do with gathering, pulling together resources, and potentially some kind of figure who is able to redistribute them. So Rhiannon also noticed from gathering together loads of data that there seemed to be a decline in their use. And she was asking me to look at that decline. But also Andy and Rhiannon together wanted me to look at the 2 data sets to compare them to see if the chronological evidence shows that they're declining at the same time, and then if they are, what that could be caused by, if it's possible to identify reasons. So those of you who work in this period will immediately think of potential reasons, because there are some kind of big grand narrative type explanations for social change in this period. Big ones being climate change. So there is a early medieval cold period, which has big impacts on the continent, but its impact in Britain, particularly Western Britain, is less clear. Plague, so the plague of Justinian was ravaging the European continent at this time, but again, the impact in Britain is less clear. So then we also have to consider, is there anything else, any other possible reason which could lead to changes that are seen in these sets of evidence? So my role is looking at the chronology of these 2 data sets, neither of which were gathered initially with the aim of chronological analysis or with the intention that they would be compared. So there was quite a lot of messing around and pulling together different data sets. But overall, the 2 sets of data have loads of really nice radiocarbon data associated with them. There are several different ways, several different approaches to combining radiocarbon data from multiple sites. Some people prefer some methods, some people prefer others. I've used some probability distribution in the past. That's one method of combining dates. But in this case, we chose to use another method called kernel density estimation. So the reason why we chose this method for combining or summing radiocarbon data is, well, two reasons. Firstly, work had been done in Ireland using kernel density estimation as a method, looking at the same processes in the same time period. So we were really interested in making sure that our results were directly comparable to the work that we were building on. But also there is some criticism, whether you trust it or not, that the sum probability distribution methods artificially reflect spurious peaks in the radiocarbon calibration curve. So the results just reflect the shape of the calibration curve rather than the prevalence of the thing that you're interested in. So in the period that I'm looking at, we know that there is a period of climatic change, and anytime you're looking at a period of climate change, you are inevitably looking at changes to the wiggles of the radiocarbon calibration curve. The two kind of go together. So in the image on the slide, there's a single calibrated radiocarbon date with a section of the calibration curve, and this is kind of a little plateau over exactly the bit that I'm interested in looking at. So there are some issues with radiocarbon dating of this period, and kernel density estimation helped with some of that. However, I also used a heuristic analysis, which is another method of summing up non-radiocarbon dated evidence for sites as a way of kind of comparing the chronology between radiocarbon dates and between non-radiocarbon kind of typological dating evidence. So heuristic analysis is a method developed from crime science initially. So the idea is that you take the probability that an event occurred, so that's your car was broken into or that someone built a kiln, and you divide that probability of the event between the number of time slices over which the event could have occurred. So in the case of kilns, say you find a piece of Roman pottery, the probability that the kiln was built is 1 because you found it, and then you can divide that probability of 1 between the centuries in which Roman pottery was made or used in that region. So by doing that for all of your dates, you can build up a chronological profile of the shifting prevalence of non-radiocarbon dated events, sites. So I was using this one as well to, well, partly to bring in the non-radiocarbon dated evidence, but also partly as another way of, I guess, pre-addressing critiques about the impact of the radiocarbon calibration curve. So in terms of findings, this is just a kind of initial behind the scenes look at some of the process. The kernel density estimation was fine for the corn drying kilns. So corn drying kilns, they're really nice sites for radiocarbon dating because they have burnt grain in them a lot of the time. So you get nice short-lived radiocarbon samples. A lot of them are new dates, so they have short errors, and you get loads of really nice radiocarbon data which you can add together or combine in different ways. So these plots are kernel density estimation plots where you have the years AD running along the x-axis, so this is 200 to 1200 AD. The bit that we're particularly interested in is the bit shaded in as the early medieval climate anomaly. And then the y-axis is basically the peak in prevalence. So the higher the peak, the more the thing is happening. So for corn drying kilns, you can see that there's a low level in the first couple of centuries, it increases to a peak and it declines. And there are two different lines there. There's one with all of the dates, and then there's another one with only my very bestest radiocarbon dates, my very favorite ones. And there is some divergence in the later period, but it's not that big a deal because it's kind of outside the bit I was looking at anyway. With the hill forts, that was a lot more problematic for the radiocarbon methods. One of the reasons for this is that these sites are really complicated, they're multi-phase. A lot of the older excavations have very poor stratigraphic control. So the samples are from all over the place. They're often rubbish radiocarbon samples on bulk charcoal and things like that. There are lots of sites that needed to be excluded completely because of these issues. But then there are also issues that some newer excavations are just massively overrepresented in the number of radiocarbon dates. So in the bottom plot, you've got one line for all of the radiocarbon dates, and then another one just excluding one site, which completely changes the shape of the curve and the timing of the decline which we're interested in. So for this reason, I won't show you all the gory details behind the scenes of what was going on when I was trying to work out the modelling for this one. But basically, I decided that because the shape of the Hilfort's curve in particular was so badly affected by any sampling choices I made, I decided not to go down the route of using hypothesis-based testing to compare the two. And instead, we kind of just went for the standing back and saying, well, there is a decline, but explaining why we can't actually put any confidence into the timing of the decline of Hilfort's at the moment. Hopefully people will do more radiocarbon dates. But anyway, this is the version of the plot which I'm putting in the paper. So what this is showing is that in this climate period, so this is starting with the 536 event, sounds very mysterious. I think it's a volcanic eruption though. There's immediately after that, or shortly after that, there is the arrival of the Justinianic plague in Britain. This is attested in annals from Ireland, I think. And then we have this cold and wet period identified through climate records. And it's during this period that we see the decline in both sets of evidence. So the timing of the start of that decline is a little bit fuzzy, particularly with Hilfort's. It seems that there is a delayed effect, so the Hilfort's aren't declining until a few decades later. The corn drying kilns seem to have a slight peak right at the beginning of the period and then a decline. So I'm a little bit more confident with that one. So there is also the aeristic dating. And this is showing, firstly, that nobody wants to do radiocarbon dating on Roman sites. So in the dark grey is the dated kilns across each century, and in the light grey is the typologically dated kilns across each century. So the first 4 centuries, it looks like there's nobody there, nobody's using kilns from the radiocarbon evidence. But from the typological evidence, you can see that there's actually a lot of kiln activity. The difference in the pattern between the two, the chronological pattern this is quite interesting. But for the purposes of today, that pattern of decline happening between the 6th and 7th century is still there. It still stands in the two data sets. So even when you're not looking at radiocarbon data, you see the same pattern. And the decline is persistent as well in both data sets. After the 6th century, you get a decline into the 7th century, and people continue not using kilns so much for several centuries afterwards. What's really interesting, and what we didn't realise before using this method, is that that decline is also matched with a shift in what the kilns are used for. So Rhiannon had already noticed that in later periods there are more oats, and in early periods there are more barley. So this is grains identified in the excavations. But it's clear that in that period of decline, so from the 6th to the 7th century, there's a complete shift essentially from barley grains being dried out in these kilns to oat being dried out in these kilns, and that is persistent for several centuries. So that's an interesting one which came to light through this and adds in an extra dimension to our attempts to explain what's going on. So in terms of what we found from this phase of chronological modelling, Hilfort's and kilns both see a decline, and it's more or less the same time. There might be a difference of a couple of decades. It coincides with the worsening of the climate. So maybe climate change is affected, but there does seem to be a delayed effect. So it's not at the start of the climatic downturn. The decline is after the arrival of the Justinian plague, so maybe it's related. And then the pattern and timing of the decline is the same, whether you're looking at radiocarbon or non-radiocarbon evidence, you know, to the degree of precision that we can get. And there is simultaneously a shift away from barley to oats. So in terms of how we can interpret that, there are the traditional grand narratives, so the usual suspects of explanations. But actually, after reviewing the evidence available to us in our little part of the world, we've decided that neither of them is particularly good as a fit. So climate change, we know it affected Britain and Ireland. There is a record of a failure of bread. So the crops failed in 536. And we know from climate proxies that there is a period of climatic worsening, so a cold, wet period, which lasted for more than a century. But in Wales, it was already cold and wet. And what we've found is that essentially there are the people who were already living there had basically already got adaptable, diverse agricultural strategies, meaning that they don't seem to have been as badly affected by climatic worsening as people in some other areas of Europe were. So in Wales, in Western Britain, the effect of climate change doesn't seem to be as strong. In the pandemic, again, we have evidence that the Justinianic plague reached Britain, but there's no local evidence for its impact. And we know that in some areas of Britain, there was essentially none. So yes, there could have been an impact of plague, but we can't actually demonstrate that for the region that we're studying. So what we have at the moment is these two grand narrative type explanations, which could have had an impact and could have related to, say, the decline in the use of hill forts or a collapse in social structures or mass mortality or something like that, but we can't actually demonstrate it for our region. What we can demonstrate for our region, though, is a shift in religious practices, which has a direct impact on the evidence that we're looking at. So the picture on the slide is a penitential procession of Pope Gregory during the Justinianic plague. So this is a reminder that all of these things are interrelated. Religion reacted to climate change and pandemics. But key things happening in the church at this time were basically a crackdown on forms of gathering, forms of assembly, which are seen as being unchristian. So that includes meeting at these kind of gathering sites, sacrifices, burying the dead in unchristian ways, etc. All the things that you might expect to find at a post-Roman hill fort site, essentially. So over the course of the period that we're looking at, so 5th through to the 7th century, there's a shift in religious practices, with key things being a drive towards asceticism, so no fun brewing anymore, and also a big drive for land transfers from local rulers to the church, and that's something which particularly affected Wales in this period. So the sites that we're looking at, the hill forts, were exactly the kind of land, exactly the type of site which was transferred to the church. There is simultaneously a crackdown in all of the gatherings and assembly which previously took place at them. And then also we have the shift towards asceticism, which might be linked to the barley disappearing from the corn dryers. And this is further linked into this kind of shifting social norms, in that ale was not just something to be consumed at these hill fort sites as, you know, part of feasting. It was actually a key part of food rents and a key part of lordly hospitality culture in that post-Roman period. So the decline, well, the introduction of kilns is seen as being linked to the rise of exactly that kind of feasting, hospitality, food rents type culture. So we're kind of arguing that maybe the decline of them and the shift away from barley in particular is perhaps the other side of that process, so a simultaneous decline of those cultural practices associated with the church. So in the forthcoming paper, we've basically argued that although population decline could have happened in some areas during this period, there is not good evidence for it in our period, because as our sites are declining, other sites are increasing in activity. So the hill forts drop away, but wider landscape activity continues. There's no clear evidence of the impact of plague. There's no strong link between climate cooling and the decline of the sites that we're interested in. There is strong evidence that the church was actively suppressing all of the activities that are reflected by hill forts and kilns, and that while all of these things are interrelated, we favour this kind of local impact of changing religious practices as our main explanatory mechanism for what's going on in this period. So as a prehistorian, this was all quite exciting. There's lots of historical written records that we can use alongside the archaeological data and the climate proxies and all of that stuff. So I just want to briefly finish off by reflecting back on what it has been getting me thinking about prehistory. So in another collaborative project I'm currently working on, there is a new record of basically climate for all of Holocene prehistory that's come out of a lake in Norfolk. This is an annually laminated lake sediment. So we have a year-by-year record of what the local climate was. I'm not needed for chronological modelling because this annual lamination is tied in with radiocarbon dating, tree ring dating, tephra layers from volcanic eruptions, etc. So we've got the dates there. We also have this hyper-local climate record, so it's kind of 30 kilometers radius or something. So in exactly what's happening, when it's happening climatically. The 2.8 Ka event is one that we're particularly interested in from this record. So this is a prehistoric climatic event. And in that period, so this is indicated at the shift between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age on the plots on screen, there is a shift in climate, and that has been argued in the past to be accompanied by a big drop in population levels, a big shift in strategies cultural strategies for adapting to this changing climate. And essentially there are a series of grand narrative style explanations indicating that this period of climate change probably had major knock-on social impacts. So now we have this local climate record, which we can use to actually work out what was going on in the immediate area over a known chronology. It's got me thinking about how I can actually reconstruct the social impacts of climate change on a human scale. We know from this study looking at the early medieval period that yes, there is a decline in activity going over a changing climate and also reflecting the introduction of a pandemic event. However, we're arguing that actually on the basis of all of the evidence that we have, the two things are coinciding but not necessarily causative of one another. So for me at the moment, this is early stages of the research. I'm trying to work out if it's possible to reconstruct a comparable narrative for prehistory, which incorporates a wide variety of potential social mechanisms for cultural change, or if we are actually still tied down to saying there was a decline during a period of climatic change and therefore they must have caused one another. So that's something I would welcome any thoughts on from prehistorians or post-historians. But anyway, if you want more detail on the medieval stuff, this is forthcoming in medieval archaeology. And the prehistoric stuff is a little further down the road, but there are papers currently out in kind of ecology and geology type journals if you're interested in the references. All right, thank you.
Great. Well, thanks very much. That was very good. Questions from anyone?
Stop sharing.
Yeah, maybe stop sharing.
I can see people again.
You can see people. Here we are. I particularly liked the use of aoristic analysis. Not enough people know about that. It's very, very useful.
Yes, it is really useful. And it's also good for preempting any complaints about the calibration curve, I think.
Yes. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, because people
can't argue about the pottery sequence in the same way that they can argue about the climate. So
no, the only thing I would say on I like the use of kernel density estimates as well. The only thing I would say about the SPDs where they have an advantage is where you do have those sites that have a lot of overlapping dates, because it compresses those into a single sequence. But
I've been binning and combining dates from phases. So with the kilns, it's less required because most of them it's one date per site and it's on, you know, a grain. So it's, you know, the ideal for radiocarbon.
Yeah, it can't get much better than that.
Yeah, but yeah, for the hill forts, it's messy. So yeah, I've been doing, you know, the binning by site phase and combining them, and my conclusion from that is that effectively my choice of binning has a bigger impact on the chronology than anything else. And that's probably the result of not enough dates over the period, I suppose. If
Yes,
someone could go out and get another 1,000, it might be a different story.
yeah. Adam.
Yeah, thank for that. That was really cool. A really great, sophisticated use of some really interesting techniques and some really big questions that you're engaging with in a really cool way. So thank you so much. I'm wondering, do you encounter a lot of questions about sort of correlation and causation in your work, and generally, sort of how do you respond to that when those questions pop up? I'm kind of just out of curiosity. Thank you.
Yeah, I think thanks. It's a good question. And for this one in particular, we kind of preempted those questions because we've seen the same kinds of narratives of things like climate change and plague be picked up, and we're kind of going in there and saying, well, actually, yeah, sure, there was climate change, there was probably plague, but correlation is not causation in this case. And we think that the only strong evidence that we have for things impacting Wales in this time period is the impact of the church. So, you know, you could apply the same thing and say maybe it's all unrelated as well. But I think that we're pretty happy on the balance of evidence that we can identify at least some causative role of religious change in this period. But when it comes to prehistory, it's a whole other story. And this is what's been getting me thinking about it, because with my prehistorian hat on, if I saw that decline in usage of, you know, hill forts and kilns associated with a climatic event, I probably would have said, nice, done, write that up, go home for the day. And it's only looking at, you know, the medieval period where there are a range of other records to use that it's actually come clear that the story is a lot more nuanced than that. And in the absence of those kinds of records, I think a lot of prehistoric modeling of radiocarbon dates like this, it has by necessity said, well, you know, these two things are happening at the same time, so maybe they are related. And, you know, this is something that I've done myself for sure. I'm not pointing fingers or anything, but it has been getting me thinking about the kinds of stories, the kinds of narratives we can create for prehistory, and whether we should be attempting to think about more nuanced interrelations of processes. Of course, it's a lot harder when you don't actually have any written records indicating what those processes might be.
Yes, if only there were texts. Toby, you have your actual hand up.
Hi, yeah, thanks. Yeah, sorry, I can't put my fake hand up on my tablet. It's a bit difficult. Yeah, great, really interesting talk. Thank you. I'm going to ask a non-technical question, and I'm going to preface it by saying I'm not an environmental archaeologist, but in my previous work, I was looking at the different uses of crops and how that might relate to climate. And I associated oats with a cooler and wetter climate, like how Scotland is associated with an oaty diet in the post-medieval period, and barley to be quite a sensitive crop to climatic change.
Oh, really?
So, yeah, so I don't want to say the whole argument is wrong, but possibly that might be an indication of a climatic change if they are moving more to oats, which are much more tolerant to cooler and wetter conditions.
Yeah, it's interesting that you found that, because in the research, well, the stuff that we've been doing, most of the evidence has suggested that barley is actually quite resilient to climatic change, particularly wetter climates. So
okay,
who knows?
That would have been really interesting for me to know.
Yeah, I'm also not a specialist in that. So I think the stuff that we've seen has basically said that both oats and barley are resilient to wet conditions, which is what's being argued for in this transition. It's a slight cooling, but an increase in wetness. The fact that they were already growing them in Wales seem to be indicative that they were hardy enough. But yeah, I'm not a specialist in this. We're just relying on the literature that already exists about the strategies. But I think the key thing is that in the period, it looks like they were using diverse agricultural strategies already. So they were focused on basically being resilient to the climate. So, you know, that some people have argued that a drop off in activity like that indicates, you know, a decline in population or something, whereas we think it's a shift in, you know, some reason why they're not growing barley as much other than the climate. But yeah, I mean, it's I suppose the jury's out then if you think that the barley is more
well, this was a long time ago, and I'm not an environmental archaeologist. So,
I have to wait for the barley specialist to come and destroy the article then.
I'm sure there are some. James.
So, yep, enjoyed that very much. And I want to go back with our prehistoric caps on, because I'm a bit of a prehistorian too. And I'm interested, and I know this is going to be really unfair, really, but like, because you're thinking about this now, what, in the absence of text in prehistoric period, what are the processes that you are, if you want to move away from this environmentally deterministic approach to prehistory, what are you going to look at then that to sort of like indicate, you know, what are the other processes that, you know, just not suggesting that, you know, you should have all the answers here, but it's an interesting problem, isn't it? So I just wondered where you're shining your light.
Yeah, I think that the thing that for me is the kind of obvious parallel is that all of the textual sources we're using for the church are effectively talking about cultural change. And so, you know, culture change in, you know, capital letters is a big deal in prehistoric archaeology. The question, of course, is if we're looking back at prehistory, we don't know which elements of cultural change as we see it were actually significant in the same terms as the religious change. So my PhD was looking at changing burial practices as an indicator of, you know, this wider spread cultural change, indicating, you know, shifts in population and all these kind of broader scale processes. So I've previously looked at burial practices as indicative of something else going on, with the assumption that how people bury their dead is really important to them. So I would say that a shift in burial practices indicates some kind of shift in how people are thinking as well as how they're behaving. But yeah, when we're looking at culture change more broadly in prehistory, I think there is this issue of how significant in terms of how people are thinking and behaving and living their lives some of these changes actually are, because there's the assumption that if we can find it, it must be important, but you know, not all change is of the same level of significance to how people see themselves or how they behave in the world. So yeah, it's a really tricky one because we can see things changing, we can model things changing, we can look at the relationship between that and, you know, population change or climate change or whatever, but knowing which things are likely to be actually significant in terms of causative relationships is a really hard one.
It is. Yeah, it is. It's very nuanced, and a lot of it could be quite sort of intangible, I suppose. But yeah, interesting. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Yeah, there's an analogous problem in the in classics, which you may have heard about, in that nobody's quite sure how important figure painted pottery was. There's a ton of it, but maybe it's all that survived, you know.
I've been avoiding that one so far.
It's there if you want it. Benedict has a question in the chat. What impact do you think this research and research like it has on debates in current climate change? What impact should it have?
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. So one of the things that we were thinking about with this research is that there is a tendency based on well, effectively research from continental Europe to associate these climatic changes, particularly the one we're looking at, with dramatic cultural change, which you could even call collapse. So there is a relationship established in the literature that climate change equals devastation, social collapse, the end of everything we know it. But what we were actually finding looking at, you know, cold, damp Wales is that communities were resilient. They changed the way they were living. There does seem to have been a shift in who was in power. So a change in, you know, who's at the top of society, effectively from local lords to the church, which could be associated with the climatic shift. But broadly speaking, people societies survived, there isn't a massive population collapse. So in terms of the lessons to have, I suppose it depends on your political leanings, whether you say, yeah, it'll be all right, don't worry about it, or whether you can take the message that, maybe we can oust the people in power and continue as a society. But I suppose what you do with the research is up to you.
Well, that sounds good. I mean,
The latter one.
Yeah, humans are great survivors. We wouldn't be here having this conversation if we weren't.
Exactly.
But it certainly wouldn't be very pleasant to live through. Adam.
Yeah, this is kind of spinning off that last question a bit. Obviously, this is a group of archaeologists, and we're having very archaeologist-like responses to the questions that you're raising. I'm actually wondering, have you had a lot of opportunity to present some of this research to like environmental scientists or scholars working in other disciplines to kind of see what they think about what your findings are?
Not this one, no. This has been quite focused on the world of medieval archaeology, but the other paper I'm working on with the prehistoric climate record, that's led by climate scientists and geographers. So I'm the token archaeologist attempting to explain what's happening with their sediments that they're finding. So it's a completely different position to be in with the two, and it is really interesting to see the big differences in how the two groups of people are talking about it. I suppose I'm kind of somewhere in between the two disciplines of medieval archaeology and environmental research. I'm equally far from both. But yeah, it's very, very different approaches, very different ways of thinking about it. And I think in the climate scientist world, they are expecting more in the way of causative knock-on impacts on cultural practices, but then they're not as familiar with the existing literature about how people react and change in prehistory. So it is interesting. But yeah, I've not presented this stuff to any climate scientist people or ecologists or anything like that yet, but it would be interesting to do that, see what they say.
Well, and I thought Adam was going to go for an economic angle there. That was, well, I mean, no, but for real, I mean, because you have a definite economic shift there in terms of brains and centralization and that sort of thing.
Yeah. I mean, the role of climate change and what seems to be a massive shift in economy as well as social structure is an interesting one. I dread to think what the economists would do with this information, but I suppose I could present to them anyway.
It'd be interesting.
Thank you.
Anything else? Any other questions? If there aren't any other questions, then we'll just thank you again. That was really cool. I'm sorry that you're not here, that we can take you for lunch now, but at the same time, you don't have to spend all day on the train, and it's snowing up here, so maybe you wouldn't have even made it.
Okay, nice. Well, yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. It was really nice speaking to you all, and yeah, having your interesting questions as well. And yeah, I've spotted things in the chat as well, so I will, the Tony Wilkinson stuff. Yeah, good. Thanks for pointing it out.
Great. Okay, I think that's it.
All right.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Everyone.
See you.
Bye.